There is a truth most people only realize once they have walked far away from the storm. No contact is not the act of disappearing from someone's life. It is the act of returning to yourself. When you cut off all communication with a narcissist, you are not merely closing a door to them, you are closing a door within your mind, where the reactions, the chaos, the unconscious loops they once activated had clung for so long that you began to believe they were parts of you. Jung once said, "What remains in the shadows will continue to control your life until you bring it into the light." No, contact is the moment you begin to look directly at that darkness. But here lies the paradox. The stronger no contact is, the more dangerous it becomes if you do not understand how the darkness operates. Because silence does not only take away their stage, it also makes your memories fade. And when memories fade, the human mind has a tendency to repaint the things that once hurt us, a kind of salvational illusion that Jung called the compensation of the unconscious. This makes you easily believe that you have fully healed, that you are mature enough to talk to them again, that perhaps things were not as bad as you thought. That is when the old power resurfaces, not from the other person, but from the parts of your psyche that have not yet been illuminated. You are not weak. You are simply human, influenced by a very natural psychological mechanism. When we are no longer exposed to the toxin, we forget how deeply it harmed us. And that forgetting becomes fertile ground for the narcissist's return through hoovering messages, emails, apologies, promises, beautiful memories, all crafted to touch the unconscious regions you have not yet strengthened. Therefore, to truly break their power, no contact has never been enough. You must know what to do within that silence. You must know how to keep your mind aligned with truth. You must know how to anchor yourself in reality instead of illusion. You must know how to let silence become sovereignty, not a trap built from memories. And that is exactly what we will discuss today. The one action you must take when going no contact, to completely dismantle the narcissist's power, not only in the physical world, but in your mind, your energy, and the entire structure of your unconscious. Part 1. The invisible threat of no contact. When you enter no contact, the first thing that disappears is not the narcissist, it is the sharpness of the memory. People often believe they free themselves from someone by walking away, but the truth is that we only truly escape when the mind is no longer held by them. And it is here that the silent threat of no contact begins. When the toxicity is no longer in your line of sight, your mind does what it always does to protect you. It blurs the pain, softens what once shattered you, turning wounds that were recently still throbbing into something that seems not as bad as I remembered. This is not weakness. This is the unconscious defense mechanism Jung described as the compensation of the shadow. When the external threat is gone, the mind automatically fills the space with gentle illusions to maintain a sense of stability. In the silence of no contact, when you are no longer thrown into arguments, late-night angry messages, passive-aggressive jabs, or psychological games, an empty space emerges. That empty space is where danger hides, because darkness does not exist only in the narcissist's presence, it exists in the memories that have been selectively filtered. You remember the beautiful dates but forget the nights you were gaslit. You remember the tenderness at the beginning but forget the cold emotional abandonment at the end. You remember when they made you feel special but forget when they made you doubt your own reality. And because memory is the doorway into emotion, every pleasant memory that gets reactivated is a fragment of power returning to the person you thought you had escaped. The narcissist understands this better than you think. Hoovering is not impulsive. It is a strategy activated precisely when they sense that you have softened, forgotten, or grown overly confident. They don't need to change. They only need you to forget who they truly were. And no contact if you don't execute it correctly, becomes the perfect environment for that forgetting to occur. This is why many people who are strong right after the breakup fall into the hoovering trap months later, not because they became weaker, but because their mind is no longer being reminded by fresh, painful experiences. No contact removes the new data that kept you aware. And when new data stops coming, the unconscious begins creating a pain-reduced version of the past. That is human nature. It is also the doorway to recontamination. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the shadow slips back, not through the narcissist's actions, but through the softened memories inside you. And once the shadow returns in the form of nostalgia, you begin to feel strong enough to face them, rational enough to answer a harmless message, mature enough to sit down and talk like two civilized people. You do not realize that the moment you think, "I'm fine now," is the moment you are psychologically closest to them again. That is the invisible threat of no contact. Not their presence, but the absence of the reminders that once guarded your boundaries. Part 2. The opposite path. When you can't go, no contact. There is a strange but extremely important paradox in the journey of breaking free from a narcissist. Sometimes the people who cannot go no contact are the ones who see the truth most clearly. When you still have to see them because of children, finances, shared home, family obligations, or circumstances that don't allow you to disappear completely, you are thrown into a reality that those who go no contact early never face. The raw truth of who they are once they lose control over you. This is no longer the subtle manipulation of the love bombing phase. This is the unveiling of the shadow that Jung called shadow inflation. The shadow swelling when their ego feels threatened. When they no longer hold you in their psychological orbit, they no longer need to perform. And when they stop performing, you see everything. The irrational anger, the petty revenge, the bitter messages, the accusations, the passive-aggressive posts, the controlling behaviors disguised as concern, and the cruelty that only someone who once loved you can weaponize deeply enough to hurt. This is the part that early no-contact people never witness, and because they don't witness it, they easily forget. Those who cannot go no contact do not have that privilege. They are not allowed to forget. Every time they respond to an email about the child, every time they face the cold eyes during custody exchange, every time they receive an insult disguised as concern, every time they are blamed for everything. These are living data points, real data, unalterable data that shatter all illusions. Instead of rosy recollections, they have accurate memory. Instead of romanticizing, they get constant updates about the person's unchanged nature. And these reminders, though painful like cuts, slowly build immunity. This is the process Jung described as confrontation with the shadow, facing the darkness until you no longer hold any illusions about it. Many people try to be civil, to co-parent peacefully, to keep the family functioning, to be mature, until reality exposes one truth. You cannot negotiate with the shadow. You can only recognize it. And those who cannot go no contact are forced to recognize it sooner, clearer, and more consistently. This creates a kind of psychological antibody that early no contact individuals often lack. They are not easily shaken when the narcissist hoovers. They are not tempted by apologies, and they are not seduced by beautiful memories, because reality has just exposed the whole truth not long ago. Not being able to go, no contact, makes healing slower, more painful, more exhausting, yes, but that continuous friction makes awareness an instinct. They don't have to fight to remember why they left. The reason messages them weakly, stares at them with that condescending gaze, reveals itself in each inhumane gesture, only visible to someone who has seen behind the mask. They don't need to remind themselves. Reality reminds them. And then one day, those who cannot go no contact realize something profound. They no longer fear them, no longer crave their validation, no longer hope for change, no longer react when they explode, no longer feel wounded when they twist the truth. That is when the narcissist's power collapses, not because you ran away, but because you have looked at them long enough to break the final illusion. They were never as powerful as you once believed. Part 3. What you must do when you go no contact. Going no contact is not merely the act of cutting off communication. It is a psychological transition that forces your entire nervous system to learn a new way of existing. When the narcissist disappears from your daily life, the first thing that vanishes is not the pain, but the internal reminder system that used to keep you alert every single day. And this is exactly where many people lose their defenses, because they do not understand what Carl Jung called the unconscious compensation of the shadow. When the external threat is no longer present, the unconscious creates a softer version of the memory to maintain a false sense of safety. If you do not intervene consciously, your own mind will reopen the door for the narcissist to return. The most important thing you must do during no contact is anchor yourself to the truth by building a psychological feedback system. In Joseph Ledoux's research on memory reconsolidation, he shows that memory is not a fixed film reel, but a recording constantly edited each time we recall it. This means the further you move away from the moment of trauma, the more your brain tends to blur it in order to reduce stress. This is beneficial when you're healing, but extremely dangerous when dealing with a narcissist, because when the memory softens, the boundaries soften too. Therefore, you must preserve the truth in a form that cannot be altered. Notes, journals, evidence, and descriptions of your original emotional states. This is not to nurture resentment, but to prevent your brain from creating the romanticized illusion described by psychologist Donald Hebb. When positive neural connections are activated repeatedly, they can overshadow negative memories unless those memories are deliberately reinforced. This is why many people, after a few months of no contact, begin to feel that maybe things weren't as bad as I thought. That is not truth. That is the brain reconstructing memory in a more pleasant way. Next, you must understand another crucial mechanism, the Zeigarnik effect, a psychological phenomenon discovered by Bluma Zeigarnik in 1927. She proved that the brain clings more tightly to unfinished tasks than to completed ones. A relationship with a narcissist always ends in an unfinished state. No answers, no closure, no accountability, no acknowledgement. This makes your mind want to go back, to search for an explanation. If you do not create psychological closure for yourself by documenting the truth and locking it into a complete file, the Zeigarnik effect will cause your mind to reopen the old tab. This is why you must write your own conclusion to the relationship. Instead of waiting for them to give you a closure they are fundamentally incapable of giving. Additionally, Bessel van der Kolk's research, The Body Keeps the Score, shows that the body retains emotional memory in the form of sensations, meaning that the emotions you do not document and consciously process will return as longing, loneliness, or softness that you cannot explain. Writing is not just a cognitive activity. It helps the body release memory from a vague sensory form back into a structured data format. When memory is translated into language, it moves from the right hemisphere, intuition, emotion, to the left hemisphere, logic, reasoning. Daniel Siegel calls this integration, the kind of integration that produces self-regulation. This is why recording the truth makes you less vulnerable to hoovering. You have transformed emotional memory into structured, logical memory. After that, you must establish a truth reminder system. Human memory tends toward motivated, forgetting if a memory interferes with the brain's desire for a comfortable emotional state. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman showed that memory editing is a self-protective instinct. Therefore, without intentional reminders, negative memories will automatically be distorted. This is what makes you vulnerable to hoovering even when you believe you are strong. You must have a schedule. Review your journal every 1-2 weeks, reread emotional descriptions, revisit old messages if necessary. This isn't living in the past. It is maintaining the accuracy of memory, the same way a scientist maintains experiment records to prevent deviation. Finally, you must stop idealizing the good moments. Psychologist Robert Sternberg, in his triangular theory of love, points out that moments of high connection do not reflect the essence of a relationship. They reflect temporary synchronization between two nervous systems. Narcissists weaponize these moments as bait. If you do not remember who they truly are, the brain will keep these highlights as a form of emotional self-soothing. And that is the gateway for hoovering. When you build this entire system, raw documentation, emotional evidence, psychological closure, truth reminder cycles, you are no longer merely maintaining boundaries. You are restructuring your cognitive map, making truth your new anchor. At that point, no contact is no longer an act of avoidance. It becomes an act of psychological sovereignty, and that is what destroys the narcissist's final source of power. Part 4. Why this destroys their power. When you correctly carry out the steps of anchoring the truth, a particular psychological phenomenon occurs. The narcissist's power begins to collapse not from the outside, but from within the unconscious structure of your own mind. In Otto Kernberg's research on borderline and narcissistic personality disorders, he emphasizes that the narcissist's power does not lie in their actions, but in their ability to maintain emotional ambiguity in the victim, the space between the beautiful memories and the painful ones, where hope mixes with fear, where the need for validation collides with the fear of abandonment. When you consciously anchor the truth and destroy that ambiguity, you collapse the very structure their power depends on. This is what Jung called the depotentiation of the shadow. The shadow does not need to disappear. It loses power simply by being seen in its true form. Narcissists do not manipulate you through strength. They manipulate through perceptual delay. Before you even understand what is happening, they have already spun the narrative in their favor. While you are still deciphering your emotions, they have already triggered a new cycle. While you are trying to recall a memory, they plant another one to make you doubt yourself. This is why what they fear most is someone who knows exactly what they are dealing with. When your psychological feedback system is activated, documentation, evidence, truth reminders, psychological closure, you strip away the delay time they rely on to manipulate. You respond faster than your unconscious reactions. You are no longer being led by emotion. You destroy their power by reclaiming the right to interpret the story. From a neurological perspective, this creates an even deeper shift. Neuroscientist Richard Davidson demonstrates that when a memory is shifted from emotional form into linguistic form, activity in the amygdala, the center of fear and threat response, drops sharply, while activity in the prefrontal cortex, the center of reason and decision-making, increases. This means every time you write down the truth, you weaken the neural link that once connected your pain to that person. And every time you reread it, you strengthen the parts of the brain responsible for healthy decision-making. In this way, you transition from someone who reacts emotionally into someone who responds cognitively, what Daniel Goleman calls emotional mastery. When this happens, the narcissist loses the thing they need most: emotional connection to you. They do not need you to love them. They need you to react to them. Every form of emotional engagement, anger, hurt, arguing, explaining is fuel. But when you master your memory, emotions, and reactions, their presence no longer creates ripples in your emotional field. You are no longer pulled by their sudden tenderness, their fake apologies, or their reminders of the good times. The emotional hooks they once embedded in you no longer have anything to latch onto. And when there is no reaction, They lose the ability to validate their own existence through you. In Jungian psychoanalysis, the power of the shadow is always tied to projection. Previously, you unconsciously projected your goodness onto them. Your compassion became hope, your honesty became trust, your understanding became attempts to heal them. When you anchor the truth, you withdraw those projections. You no longer see them through the lens of your soul. You see them as they are, a personality structure built on shame, emptiness, and a need for control. When projection is withdrawn, they have no foothold in your psyche anymore. This is the moment Jung calls the withdrawal of the anima, animus projection, the moment you reclaim the energy once trapped inside them. And when that happens, their power evaporates instantly. Finally, when you sustain the truth long enough, the most dangerous thing for them occurs. You become immune. Not immune in the sense of feeling nothing, immune in the sense that they no longer control what you feel. Like a virus that cannot adapt to an immune system that has learned its signature, the narcissist cannot adapt to someone who has seen their nature clearly. They lose the ability to create illusion. They lose the ability to create emotional disturbance. They lose the ability to scramble your perception. From their point of view, you are no longer supply. You are a mirror, and their power cannot survive in the presence of a mirror that is no longer afraid of the dark. Part 5, the final separation, when their reality can no longer touch yours. There is a moment that very few people realize is profoundly important. The moment you no longer react to the narcissist's existence. Not because you hate them, and not because you fear them, but because you no longer share the same energetic field with them. In Jungian psychology, this is when the psychic orbit breaks, the psychological orbit shatters, and your soul detaches from the gravitational pull of the shadow. This is not a victory earned through effort. It is a natural phenomenon that occurs once you have integrated enough truth, enough awareness, enough experience, enough pain, enough emotional antibodies for your mind to stop opening the door to them altogether. And this is the moment that destroys their final layer of power. A narcissist does not collapse because you leave. They collapse because you no longer want to return. When you leave physically, but your mind is still longing, still angry, still wanting an apology, still craving recognition, you are still within their orbit. But when you leave without needing a beautiful ending, without wanting to know why they did it, without hoping they will own their behavior, and without needing to prove anything, this is when the final cord snaps. A narcissist's power exists only through your emotions. When there is no emotional access left, the story ends. The fascinating thing shown in many psychological studies, especially in Dr. Eleanor Greenberg's work on narcissistic personality disorder, is that narcissists cannot tolerate emotional dead space, the emotional vacuum where they cannot trigger a reaction in the other person. This, to them, feels like being erased, and erasure is their most primitive fear. As Kernberg describes, narcissists fear psychological annihilation when they lose access to their reflection. When you reach the state in which their presence no longer stirs your body, they do not just lose power, they lose the illusion of their own identity. What devastates them most is that they can do nothing to regain space in your mind. You do not hate them, yet you no longer care. You do not wish them harm, but you no longer have a place for them in your story. You do not need them to admit wrongdoing, because the truth lives within you, not in their words. This is what Jung calls the emergence of the self, the rising of the true self beyond all projections. When this self emerges, all unconscious trauma-bonded relationships collapse naturally. You no longer need to force yourself to let go. You simply are no longer held. At this point, the narcissist may attempt every strategy: gentle hoovering, angry hoovering, victim hoovering, moral hoovering, attacking hoovering, nostalgic hoovering. But all of them fail because what they are touching no longer reaches the place in you that has healed. You do not need revenge. You do not need to prove anything. You do not need to win. Your silence is no longer defense. It is your nature, a version of you that has seen the shadow, survived it, dissolved and reorganized itself, reclaimed the inner flame, and now fears no energy that tries to take it. This moment is not loud. There is no declaration, no conversation, only one truth. They no longer have access to you. You have stepped into another dimension, the dimension of the awakened, the soul reclaimed, the one who closed the door not with anger but with peace. And peace is the one thing a narcissist cannot enter, cannot manipulate, cannot break. This is the final separation, not the ending between two people, but the separation between your soul and their shadow. From that moment on, they are no longer a part of you, and you are no longer the stage where their darkness seeks reflection. Part 6. The shift within you. When your inner landscape changes forever. There is a subtle yet decisive change that most people don't notice once they've truly moved beyond the narcissist. Your inner landscape is no longer the same. This is the moment when healing is no longer something you do, but something you are. And this shift is what permanently destroys their ability to come back, because the narcissist doesn't live in your actual daily life. They live in the version of you that exists inside your own mind. When that inner version transforms, they have nowhere left to attach. In Jung's language, this is the stage of psychic reorganization. It's not that you are trying to be stronger. It's that your nervous system has automatically built a new structure after receiving enough data about the truth. The evidence comes from everything you've done. Anchoring the truth, journaling your emotions, deconstructing illusions, withdrawing projections, observing their post-breakup behavior, surviving, hoovering, resetting your boundaries, and ultimately no longer depending on their validation. All of these steps are the unconscious bricks rebuilding your inner system. When this structure forms, a very specific change occurs. Your brain no longer reacts to them in the old way. Research by Bessel van der Kolk and Dan Siegel shows that when emotional memories have been processed and transformed long enough, the neural pathways tied to fear, dependency, or emotional volatility gradually weaken, like old paths overgrown with moss when no one walks them anymore. In contrast, new neural pathways, grounded, alert, boundaried, directed, grow stronger. That's why when you look back at old messages, instead of pain, you just feel amused. When you remember old arguments, instead of trembling, you just find them pointless. When you think about the possibility of them returning, instead of anxiety, you just feel too uninterested to respond. This is the clearest sign that their power has been erased from your nervous system. This shift also creates a phenomenon psychologist Harriet Lerner calls the differentiated self. It means you are no longer pulled into other people's emotions, no longer dissolved into their fears, hopes, or reactions. You become a system strong enough to remain closed, not easily invaded by external emotional fields. In this configuration, the narcissist can no longer trigger you, because you no longer rely on them to define your worth, and they no longer hold any key to open hidden doors in your unconscious. And then you begin to realize something deeper. You no longer search for reasons for them to change, no longer want their acknowledgement, and no longer wait for an apology. Not because you've forgiven or forgotten, but because they have dropped off the psychological map of your world. It's like growing up and no longer fearing the monster that haunted you in childhood. Not because the monster disappeared, but because you now understand it was only a shadow with no real power in your adult reality. This is also tied to Leon Festinger's concept of experiential disconfirmation in cognitive dissonance theory. When lived experience repeatedly contradicts an old belief, that belief is eventually destroyed. That is exactly what happens when you do. No contact correctly, every day without them, every week of peace, every month without emotional chaos, all of it reinforces a new truth. You are better off without them. And once this new truth becomes the default structure in your mind, The narcissist cannot return, not because you are avoiding them, but because they no longer fit into the new inner ecosystem you live in. At this stage, you no longer need to self-soothe. You don't need to talk yourself out of temptation. You don't need to avoid them as an act of effort. You simply no longer receive their frequency. Their presence doesn't produce any emotional rhythm in you, like a radio that no longer picks up that signal. This is the deep separation, when your soul no longer operates on the same psychological level as theirs. And here is the astonishing part. You haven't just escaped a person, you've escaped the version of yourself that was once controlled by them. That is the deepest liberation. No contact gives you not their absence, but your return. When you reach the end of this journey, there is one truth you must carry with you for life. No contact is not a door closing on the narcissist. It is a door opening for you to walk back into yourself. Because true victory was never about making them regret, suffer, or recognize your worth. Victory happens at the moment you no longer seek any of that. When you do no contact the right way, when you anchor the truth, restructure memory, withdraw projections, pull your energy back, stop reacting, stop seeking explanations, and stop allowing them to touch your emotional field, you have dismantled their power completely without a fight. In Jungian analysis, this is the moment the self rises. The true self steps out of the ruins of the old ego, out of the fragments of illusion, out of the layers of shadow that once kept you bound. You don't become someone else. You return to who you were before fear and manipulation shaped you. And this is what the narcissist cannot bear. Not that you left, but that you return to your true self. A self they cannot control, cannot manipulate, and cannot defeat. You must understand that everything they ever did, from idealization to devaluation, from gaslighting to silent treatment, from fake love to covert abuse, existed because they needed you to react. And when you step into true no contact, a form of silence rooted in sovereignty, you take back the one thing they needed most, the ability to steer your emotions. Once you learn not to react, you cease to be supply. Once you hold on to the truth, they have no illusion left to lean on. Once you stop oscillating, they lose the projection screen that once reflected them back to themselves. Once your mind is no longer open to them, they lose the only doorway they ever had into your world. There is one thing the strongest survivors all understand after this journey. You do not need them to admit anything for you to be free. The truth does not live in the apology they will never give. The truth lives in your experience, in what you recorded, in what you witnessed, in what you survived. And when you stand on that ground, fully informed, fully awake, fully sovereign, you step into a new life where your peace is no longer threatened by someone who needs you to be smaller so they can feel bigger. In the end, this is not just a story about leaving a narcissist. It is a story about leaving an old reality, one where you were pulled into cycles of pain, fear, and illusion. It is also a story about stepping into a new reality, where you live by truth, by awareness, and by a freedom no one can take from you. The narcissist cannot follow you into that reality, because they only exist in places where ambiguity still has a doorway. Once you step into the light, once your mind is no longer a stage where their shadow can perform, once your soul has reclaimed its energy from every place it was once entangled, the game ends. No, contact doesn't just cut off communication. It cuts off the invisible power they once held over you. And in that silence, in the space they can no longer invade, you finally hear what you lost somewhere along the way, your own voice. That is the real victory. Not winning against them, but winning back the place within you that once believed they had the right to define who you are.